All right. Well, welcome to the Arts Council. If you haven't been here before, this is our Firehouse Museum. We've got some fantastic stuff for you to see here. And there's also a really cool show upstairs in our Firehouse Gallery, which I would recommend that you just swing through before you leave on your way out. I am Liz Goad. I'm the Director of Grants here at the Arts Council. I've talked to most of you before, either via email or over the phone, but if not, feel free to come and introduce yourself when we're done. You'll see here from our opening screen, our DAF grant, just some important facts right out the gate. Deadline, July 13th, and that is at 5 p.m. sharp. They're going to do a strict cutoff at that point, so make sure you get it in early. And right under that, you'll see that you apply at mygovernmentonline.org. That is a first for the DAF grant. So if you haven't already gone online and created a profile at MGO, go ahead and do that soon to work out any kinks or bugs that you might have. Today, just to give you a little rundown of what we're going to cover, I'm going to talk about the grant guidelines. I'm going to talk about the content of the application, eligibility, those kind of things. What I'm not going to cover is a play-by-play of the actual MGO website. Even though that's a new thing that we're using this year, there is a really great tutorial online. There's both a printed tutorial, or I should say a document that you can go through, and there's also a video, which is way more thorough than I could ever be because I'm also new to this system. But if you go through those tutorials and you still have any specific questions, please feel free to ask me. I just didn't want to waste everybody's time today since you can get all that on your own. Just some general information from the start. If you don't know what DAF stands for, it's Decentralized Art Funding. The state has funding available for the arts. They decentralize it, send it out to all the regions, and then we distribute it among our parishes. So we get that money through Louisiana Division for the Arts. It does come from the state budget, specifically from tourism, not arts. And there's the Division of the Arts new logo. These are the parishes that we serve through the DAF grant. So if you work and have your domicile in any of these parishes, you are eligible to apply through this Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge. If you're doing work in a different parish, you can still apply for DAF, but you would go through a different one of the regional arts councils. Come talk to me when we're done, and I can point you in the right direction. And the maximum amount that you can request for the DAF grant varies depending on which parish you are in. That's determined by the state based on census figures. It's basically, it's based on the population in your parish. It's the same as last year, so if you've applied before, your maximum request is going to be the same as what you've done for the 2018 grant. Just looking at the general guidelines, and I really did go through the grant guidelines to make this presentation, so when you go through and read them, if you haven't already, you'll see it follows kind of the same pattern here. Looking at what the Division of the Arts talks about as the purpose of the DAF grant, even though that's not the nitty-gritty of the application itself, I would recommend reading it because you can really find out what they want to accomplish with these funds, and that is what the grant panelists, the reviewers, are going to use when they score your grant, how closely you align with these goals. And so it basically breaks down into three main categories of their priorities, which is accessibility. The whole purpose of the grant is to make arts accessible in every parish throughout the state. And then also, of course, quality of art, what's produced, what comes out of the project, the artists that you use, and then connectivity, so how well you bring that art into the community and the parish that you serve. Also read a little bit more deeply into the goals of the program. There are some things in there that are specific requirements, like that the activity has to occur within your own parish. And then also some things that are just best practices for your project and what they're more likely to fund. For instance, Louisiana artists are a plus. It's not required, and certainly if you have a project where you're bringing in an artist from another state, somewhere else in the country, that doesn't mean you can't be funded. We just want to know how you're going to impact people in your parish with that project. For instance, if you're bringing in somebody who's going to give a workshop, maybe they're giving that workshop to local artists, so it still benefits the local community in some way. A little bit about eligibility and who can apply for the DAF grant. Of course, 501c3 organizations. If you're a government entity, so let's say a library, a public school, you're eligible to apply. And anyone else who works through a fiscal agent that's in one of those categories. So if you are an LLC, an individual artist, and you partner with a 501c3, they are technically the applicant, you would be the sub-applicant, you're using them as a fiscal agent. Just a word about that, each organization can only submit one application. So if you're working with someone as your fiscal agent, they can't also submit their own application. It's, we only write one check to each organization. If you are a college or university, each department counts as its own entity. So the theater department can request a DAF grant, and the language arts, they can submit multiple applications. I would recommend that if you think that's going to be the case, if you are applying as a university and you know of others in your university that are applying, talk to each other, make sure you're really clear in your application which department that you're in, and then just make sure you're not offering some kind of duplication of services with your other departments that are applying, because the panelists and our representatives at the state want to see that we're not giving two grants to the same entity, and that'll just make the proposal a lot stronger. This is just a chart that shows who can apply for what. There are two categories of funding that you can apply for through the DAF grant. You'll see on the first column, project assistance. This is requesting funds to support a particular project or program that you are offering. And you can see here, everyone in those categories is eligible to apply. So if you're a nonprofit, but let's say you're in the healthcare sector or not an arts organization, you can still apply if that project is arts-based and providing some kind of arts, meets all the other eligibility requirements for projects. Same with schools, government agencies, colleges, and universities. Art projects are golden. If you want to apply for organizational support, you have to be a nonprofit, 501c3, whose mission is arts-based. So that has to be at the core of everything that you do. And that just means that we know that the funding is going to go to support the arts. What specifically do we fund with this grant? These are the artistic disciplines that the state defines as eligible for grant funding. You can see dance, design, folk life, music, media, theater, visual arts, and crafts. Certainly there are countless subgenres within each of these. If you're not sure if your project qualifies, just let me know and I can kind of help you determine whether or not it's an eligible project. And of course, all grants that are funded the activities need to take place between these two dates of October 1st, 2018 and September 30th, 2019. So if it's general operating support, we're funding your operations between those two dates. If it's a project, it needs to take place between those two dates. Sometimes people have projects that are ongoing. Typically you want to request funding for a project that is definitive, but if it's something that you prepare for an entire year, that's okay. It just means that the funds can only go to support activities that take place within these dates. So if you pay for a consultant to come and give you information about how to carry out that project, and they come in before October 1st, doesn't mean you can't apply, just we can't fund that particular part of your project. And you want to be really specific about that in your application. If you do have a project that kind of straddles those dates, I would recommend just contacting me and I can give you some more specifics. And also, going back to this slide, There are some specific requirements within each of these disciplines as to what's eligible and what's not. So just read a little bit more about that in the guidelines. Like, for example, landscape architecture is eligible, but you wouldn't be able to use those funds to buy, dirt and other supplies. It's only certain activities within each of those genres, and they try to be as specific as possible in these guidelines. If you don't see the expense that you're looking for and you're not sure if it's eligible, of course, let me know. Oops, no, I need to go forward now. Some of the things that we don't fund in this grant, there is a long, exhaustive list in the guidelines. I'm not going to run through all of them, but I just wanted to highlight here some of the ones that come up the most commonly in proposals and even in reports. Things that the grant cannot fund: food and hospitality. There's sometimes a little bit of a gray area with food that's used for art. Just ask me about it if you're not sure. Decor, something like flowers or other decorations for an event wouldn't be eligible. Speaking of events, fundraisers are not an eligible expense. If you have a gala and the main purpose of that event is to raise money for your organization, that's not an eligible activity. It can be an event that you charge admission for. That's fine, but it just generally needs to be something that is available to the whole public. And if it's a $500 gala ticket, then that wouldn't necessarily be a totally open public event. Travel and transportation are not eligible. That's per state guidelines. So airfare and hotel. If an artist charges you a flat artist fee, let's say a performing artist, that's fine. Just list that as their artist fee, but you can't go and pay for their hotel room specifically with money from this grant, or go and buy their plane tickets. And then finally, children as artists, if there is no professional artist guiding the activities. Certainly, summer camps and other educational instructive activities are fine, they're great, and we encourage that because it's great community building kind of activity, as long as whoever is going to be guiding those activities, mentoring in whatever capacity, has the professional qualifications that we would be looking for in the guidelines. How to apply for the grant. Step one, read the guidelines. I can't stress it enough, just because it is a little bit different this year than last year. The state has created one set of universal guidelines, so everyone in every parish is applying under the same rules and regulations. It's just to make sure everything's fair and clear, and that everyone knows what's eligible and what's not. So it looks a little different than it has in the past. So I would just recommend reading that cover to cover. Next, you need to set up a profile in MGO if you haven't already, mygovernmentonline.org. And just a general word of advice is to use Microsoft Word to generate, especially your narrative, and then cut and paste that into your application. There is a word limit in this application form. You can use Microsoft to kind of monitor that and your progress, and it just makes it a lot easier to edit and spell check and those kind of things. Also, one option that's available for you, I'll talk about this a little bit later, is if you complete it in time, you can send me one draft of your application. Because this website is so new, I would just recommend, if you do want to have that draft option, to send it to me as a Word document, just because I don't yet have access on the back end to this website, and so it's just a little bit more complicated. You have to complete your application in total, and then we have to bounce it back and forth. So whatever you need me to check or look over, just use this format first. Before we really get into the content of the application and your narrative, just a word about knowing your audience for this proposal. So every DAF grant proposal is reviewed by a panel of reviewers. These are people from your community, from your parish. We try to have somebody from each parish on each panel, because there's the EBR grant, but then there's a different group. There's different application groups depending on what parish you're in. So you will have someone from your area kind of representing your parish, but they still may not know who you are, and they may not know what you do. They're not necessarily going to be artists or people who work in your field. So make your application accordingly. Describe it as if there's somebody who hasn't heard of you yet, and even have somebody who doesn't know you review it. And that's kind of a great way to know how that panel is going to react to what you've written. Another thing to know about these panelists is that they want to fund you. They want to give you money. They're generally, as you can see, really excited to help out. They may not be from the art sector, but they are committed to improving the arts through their volunteer time. They spend hours and days reviewing proposals, sitting in these meetings to decide who, who's eligible for funding and who can be funded. And if it was up to them, every panel I've sat in, they just wish they could fund everyone. So don't feel like this is just kind of an anonymous group of judges. These are people from your community who care about how we use these funds. So just think about that when you create your application. Oh, and I would also recommend come to the grant panel if at all possible. This is a public meeting. I'll send out the information well in advance so that you know when your grant is going to be reviewed. And it's just a great way to get feedback on your proposal, on your project, and just to kind of get some great tips for better grant writing. I know from hosting these panels, I've learned a lot about the grants process. Just listening to how other people's proposals are reviewed changes the way that I write. So I think it's a great thing to do if you can come for the whole day or part of the day. It's a good experience. So digging into the application itself, I'm not going to go through each item in the grant website, but this is all the information that's going to be included there. Starting out, the application is going to ask you to submit some basic information, your contact info, the amount that you're requesting, and then this new section, which is NEA descriptors. It's kind of asking you, how would you categorize your project or your organization? That's kind of a new part of the grant. If you're not sure how to answer some of those questions, you can go to this website here, and again, I'll send this to everyone. And there's a little bit of a definition for each of those as to what they mean, but just choose what makes the most sense for you. This part of the application isn't really going to go towards your total score. It's just going to kind of help us and the state gather some information about who's applying for these grants. Next, we'll get into the real meat of the application. Everything else besides those basic criteria is going to go towards your grant score. For project support, we and the panel score your grants, or your proposals rather, based on these 4 main criteria, and they're weighted with these percentages that you see listed here. So artistic merit, the quality of the work that you're going to be presenting, or the quality of the artist that you're going to hire for your project. Need and impact. This doesn't refer to how much the funding is needed, meaning, your organization is short on funds and you really need it. That's not what need means. Essentially, this means, is this project or is your organization serving a need in your community? So what need or what challenge are you addressing, or what opportunity are you addressing is really what we're looking at in that section. Also, whoever your collaborators are contributes to that part of your score, or do you have good partnerships in the community? Is this a duplication of services? That's something that kind of goes towards that score. Just a word on that, if there's a question about, are there other similar services in your community, there's not really a right or wrong answer to that, because some people tend to just say, no, we're the only ones. But that might not be true. There may be lots of summer theater camps in your area, but that doesn't mean that you can't apply. Just tell us how yours is different and what niche are you filling. Maybe you're the only one doing this particular show, or you're the only one bringing in this artist, or you serve a particular group of students that other camps don't serve. So just doesn't mean that you have to be a totally unique unicorn. It just means, tell us why it matters that this is happening, and why you're not just doing the same thing that someone else is. And the next section, planning and design, that means the planning of your project for project-based grants. So who's the staff that's going to carry out this project? Does your budget make sense? Are you allocating enough resources to all the different parts of your program? Do you have a feasible timeline for that project. How are you going to market it? How are you going to evaluate both during and after the project to determine whether it's successful? Like, do you actually have some kind of described outcomes that you want to achieve, or is it just sort of, wishy-washy? And then finally, administration and budget. And this just refers to the capacity of your organization or your school or your business to carry out this project. A lot of the ways that the panel is going to determine this score is your financials. So if you submit organizational financials, is there a deficit? Is there an explanation why? Or the application itself. Is it a well-written application? Does it look like you spent the time on it? Are parts incomplete or missing? And so that all goes towards that score. And then also, if you submit a list of your programming, is the project that you describe within the capacity or within the mission that you normally serve? Does it make sense for you? That's for project support. Organizational support, similar breakdown, but you'll see three main categories of criteria here. Artistic quality making up half of your score, so really significant there. And need and impact, so rather than the need that your project is serving, it's really the need that your organization is serving with all of your programming throughout the year. This is if you're applying for general operating support. And then finally, your administration and budget. Since it's not a project, there's no planning and design section here, but just in general, how do you run your organization? Do you use best practices, sound financial practices, those kind of things? So next, moving on to the biggest part of this application, which is the narrative. Are there any questions so far just about the application in general? Because we're going to really get into it now. I'm not going to list out each question in its entirety because you want to go back and read those from start to finish, make sure you answer each part of the question. But generally, it breaks down to these main ideas. How are you going to use the money? Keep it simple with this question. We just want to know, what are the actual funds going to be spent on? Then you'll have a chance in the next question to actually describe the project in detail. This is really where you tell the story of what you're doing, and be as specific as you can. So we want it to be exciting, we want it to be passionate, but also, don't forget who, what, when, where, why. What's actually happening here. If we get to the end of this section and we still aren't 100% sure what your project is, just go back and and start over. And I think that's kind of a trap that we all fall into when we're writing these proposals. You're so close to your project that you assume, well, everybody knows that this is an art class, and I'm just going to tell you why it's awesome. But we might not know that it's an art class. So just use clear, jargon-free descriptions of what you're doing as if, like I said, this person's never heard of you before, because that's very possible. There's going to be a question about which community you're serving and how. So is it a specific target audience? Is it your whole parish? Who are those people and how are you reaching them and why? And is this project actually the best one to serve that purpose? Accessibility is, there's a couple of different sections. This part of the narrative, just read it to figure out exactly what you need to say here. But basically, how accessible are you increasing accessibility to the arts through this project? Yes. He's asking how to define accessibility in this case. It's a little bit different on each of the applications, either for organizational support, project support. I would just recommend go into that specific question, and just read it really thoroughly. They're going to ask you some more specific questions that what I'm referring to here. But there's a later section in the grant that is specifically about physical accessibility. Can people with disabilities get into your space? And I'll refer to that later. This is more about, is it accessible to your community? So have you created programming that, what's your ticket price? Is it something that people can afford? Have you created content that is relevant to the people around you? That kind of thing. So it's a little bit of both in different sections of the application. There will also be a question about implementation of your project. This goes towards the planning and design part of your score. And so how is your project going to be implemented? Talk about how you're going to evaluate it. I think there may not even be a specific question about project evaluation, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't be helpful for you to talk about, are you going to do surveys? Are you going to do in-person interviews with whoever's participating in your project? How are you going to determine whether or not it was successful? And then finally, marketing and promotion. So how are you going to let people know about your project? And it's okay if you have a very small or no budget for marketing, depending on what your project is. If you are letting people know about your program by going into schools and meeting with principals, that's great. It just has to be relevant to what your project is. If you are going into senior centers to provide arts funding and you're just letting them know by posting something on Facebook, maybe that might not be a good connect, or maybe it is. Just show that you have done some kind of a little bit of legwork to determine how the people that you want to reach are going to find out about this project. And it doesn't have to cost a lot of money to make that happen. And then finally, evaluation. I believe on the organizational support application, there is specifically a question about evaluation, how you evaluate your programs. It doesn't hurt to mention it, whichever category you're going to apply in. So just some general advice for submitting this application. I will say that the narrative section, you've got a lot of space to work with. I think each question, they've broken it down into fewer questions, but with a lot of space to answer, something like 4,000 characters. So that's a lot of room to talk about your grant. I would say the best advice I can give there is to break it up into sections. Even if they don't give you section headers, you can make your own, as long as you're answering the questions that are posed in each section. Use bullet points, whatever kind of formatting this website will accept. It may be that you can't do any tabs or indents or anything like that, but even just some spaces. Some white space is always good. These grant reviewers are going to be looking at 30 plus proposals sometimes, depending on what parish you're in. And so when you've got this dense chunk of copy and there's all kinds of important nuggets of information in there, it can kind of get lost when you just have this one long paragraph. And so for organizing your information, just think about the person reading it and how to make it as clear as possible. Don't feel like you have to use every one of those 4,000 characters. If you can say it in less, great, because sometimes less is more. When you have all that space, it can be really tempting to just tell everyone everything about you because you're doing so many great things. But really just think about what is going to be the most useful information for this proposal. Keep it relevant to your project. And if you don't need to include it, don't. Just do whatever you can in, as much as you need and no more than that, I think is great. And then finally, I said this before, but tell your story. Of course, it's important to get those 5 W's in there: who, what, when, where, why. So you want to make sure when you're especially filling out that project description that you've got all the facts there. But you are all doing some really amazing and creative things, and we want to know about that, and the panelists want to know about that. We want to know, why is this important? Why should I care? Why does this matter? And so tell us your story, and really paint a picture with what you're doing and in this proposal. And so just get the panel really excited about that, and then it's hard not to fund you. So after your narrative, there's going to be a section of your application that's an accessibility questionnaire. So this is new to the DAF grant, and this it comes after the narrative. It's about whether or not your facilities are accessible, whether it's your organizational support or a particular project that you're hosting. is that space accessible to everyone? This thing that it's referring to, Section 504, Title II of the Americans for Disabilities Act, this is what it's referring to here. And it just says, it's designed to ensure that any program or activity receiving federal funds, which does filter through, does not discriminate on the basis of disability or for otherwise disqualified persons. So if you need a little bit more information about accessibility and whether or not you meet those requirements, NEA has a great resource on their website. If you go to arts.gov/accessibility, you can learn a little bit more about that, and that's really where the state and LDOA is modeling these requirements. They're trying to mimic what those NEA requirements are, because they do receive funding from the federal government. And so it's just best practices to make sure that everyone that they're funding and everyone that we're funding is making their programs accessible. And this website will have some information about how you can do that if that's not the case already, whether it's specific height requirements for ramps or hearing assisted devices. It really just depends on what your project is. But I would recommend just checking it out. If you already receive funds from NEA, then you're probably familiar with this. But if not, it's just a good resource. Moving on to the attachments that you'll submit with this proposal. These haven't changed much, so you'll probably be familiar with a lot of these. Of course, if you're a 501c3, you'll need to submit a letter. It's a letter from the IRS, and it's going to show your 501c3 status, when you received it. It's probably the same letter you've used for every grant, same thing. You're also going to have to submit a certificate of good standing from the Secretary of State. That is, I believe, a new requirement. We used to just check your status, and now we want you to show it, and that just shows that you've kept up with all of your filings and your taxes, and that you are an organization in good standing. And I believe on the application, there is actually a link to where you can go to the SOS website and print out your certificate, or if you have let it lapse, it's super simple to renew. It takes 5 minutes, and you can get it all online. You don't have to wait for anything in the mail. I wouldn't recommend waiting till the day of your application, but certainly if you did, I think there's still a chance. So your board of directors list. And so these first two, the 501c3 letter, the SOS certificate, this again just goes towards basic eligibility. That doesn't impact your score, really, unless it means you're not eligible to apply at all. Your board of directors does, and that's because if you use the format that is specified in this application, they're going to ask you to submit some information about your board too, which is where they work, what they do, gender and ethnicity. And that is because the state and these reviewers, they want to know, depending on who you are and what you do, is your board representative of your constituency? And so make sure that you fill that out completely. Provider of service forms, these are the people who are carrying out your project. Please be sure to include your project director, but also any artists that you're working with, and just follow the instructions on that form. It's a little bit different than the way our forms looked on the last website, but it's the same basic information. You'll need contact information for those artists and how much you're paying them, and whether you're paying them from the grant or from another source. If you are working with a school for your project, then you'll need to get a letter of intent from the school. It can be from an administrator, a teacher. Administrator is preferred, but you'll want to get some confirmation that the school has approved this activity. I know it's summertime now, so if you don't have it yet, get started, because that's usually what takes the longest. And then for project, these are all the documents that are required for project support and organizational support. The project budget, obviously, that's just if you have a project that you're looking for support. Or if it's organizational, it's your whole operating budget for the year. And this next group, I think, is just required for organizational support, which would be your IRS Form 990. I think there might be an alternative document that you can use. It's listed in the application, but basically the panel and the state just want to look at your finances to see that, you know, what the capacity of your organization is if you're applying for general operating support. A strategic plan, and a list of your programs. So these are required, and all of these are really going to contribute to your score on the grant because your budget and your 990 are going to speak towards the fiscal soundness of your operations, and your strategic plan is also going to speak towards your administrative capacity, your list of programs, that's really talking about the quality of what you present. Yeah, it's an uploaded document, and if you don't have a strategic plan, you'll need to submit something in that place. Talk to me about it if that's the case, and we'll figure out an alternative. But it's, you know, if not, then project support may be a better way to go.
Question?
Yes.
The organizational budget, the 990, and then the grant budget are sometimes 3 different time periods. The numbers have to match up.
No. So the project budget, if you're doing an organizational support grant, you don't need a project budget. But for the organizational budget, that's for your current year. The 990 is likely going to be for a previous year, so that's fine that they're not the same. In fact, I think it's better because they want to see how are you doing this year, what's your plan for this year financially, what's the reality of maybe the year before last, depending on when your 990 was completed, but they don't necessarily have to be the same time. I see. I see.
You will have to account for what you will actually spend during that time versus.
That's right. Yes. Yes. So as long as the funds are spent in the current year, it's okay if you have a calendar year budget or a fiscal year that starts in June. Just identify where the money is going to go after October 1st. Did you have a question?
Yes, it's color coded right there. The orange is only organization.
That is what only organizational support grants must submit. However, if you are filing for organizational support, you will have to submit a 501c3 letter, an SOS certificate, board of directors. So there's some that both will have to do, but what's in blue is all that's required for project support grants. And supplemental documents. So these are the optional attachments, and this can be really whatever you want. It's up to you. I would say, you know, some good suggestions would be photos of your events, if you have brochures, if you have artist bios that you didn't get to include in the provider of service forms. Maybe you're working with a very exceptional artist and you want to include some samples of their work. There are additional spaces outside of these attachments where you can submit sample video links to videos, but there is a 2-minute limit on each of those videos, so you can't necessarily submit something that's 5 or 10 minutes long. You just have to kind of find an excerpt. But I would suggest for these supplemental documents to keep it relevant to the project. So, you know, your whole season brochure, you know, if it's concise and it really describes who you are, attach it. But if it's, you know, if there's 20 pages, then that might kind of just get lost in the shuffle. Keep it to what's relevant to your project, unless you're doing organizational support. If you are going to submit photos or really any attachment, label it and caption it, so we know what we're looking at. So this picture that I showed before, it's beautiful. Everybody's having a good time. What's happening here? I don't know. You wouldn't know unless I captioned it that this is our Ebb and Flow Festival from 2018. Otherwise, it just looks like some people having a good time at an event, and the reviewers might not know what they're looking at. Yes?
Yes, I'm sorry. Did you say that we could upload audio files this time?
There's a link. She's asking if we can upload audio files to the grant. There are 3 spaces, I believe, where you can copy and paste a link to a video. So, you know, if you want to link it to YouTube, I think that will work if you have an audio file that's on YouTube, but I don't think that you can actually upload an MP3. I will double check. And
We never had
No. And I think this video link is a new thing too, so I want to go back and check that. If it's not clear on the application itself, let me know and I'll look into that. But I think it should say under attachments which file types are accepted. And so if that's PDF or documents or spreadsheets, then probably no. But if it does list MP4 as an option, then yes, you can. I don't think that that's the case.
And I always apply for children's choir.
Okay.
I try to show what we do with pictures.
Sure. Then I would say if it's possible for you to find somebody who can upload that onto a website. It's fairly easy to put that on YouTube, and you don't have to have a video to go with it. If it's just a still, label, it can say children's choir, the name of your choir, and the date of the event, and just the audio is playing, then that will work fine. YouTube can work for video or audio. Yes.
Last year we had I think there was a section where we just listed the links, and it was linked to our Facebook page.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. If you, yeah, she asked if you could include links to your Facebook page. I would say the best thing to do there, because the blanks that are available on this site I think they're specifically for video links. But if you want to include a document, like maybe a Word document that has links to your website with maybe some screen grabs, would be, kind of visually compelling. My recommendation is just to save it as a PDF so you don't have any formatting issues. But previously, before we could do actual links to the video embedded in the website, I recommended to people to put it in a document, put that link in a document, and then they will go in, click on that, and then follow it to wherever they need to go. Again, same advice, keep it relevant to the project itself, and know that if they go to your website, if it's just generally to look around, it's probably gonna be some quick scrolling and that's it. So if you want them to see something in particular, send them right there. Yes, absolutely. I wanna go back and talk a little bit more about project budget, because there is a new requirement this year that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is a cash match. This is new to the DAF program. That means that for every dollar that you request from the DAF grant, you need to match it with 50 cents from another source of funding. So if you're asking for $1,000, you have to show that you're getting $5,000 cash from somewhere else. It's okay. I think it's okay if it's a proposed source of funding, but you want to be fairly certain that you're going to get it, because if you go to file your final report and you ended up getting no cash match, and then that's going to be a problem. And also you're going to have to specify whether or not that funding is confirmed. I talked to someone at LDOA today about which funds can qualify as a match. It just can't be funding from the state, directly from the state, like a line item state legislature, or from National Endowment from the Arts. So basically it can't be a government funded source of income, but it can go towards an expense in your project that is not eligible for DAF. So for instance, someone contacted me to say, I have cash from another source that's going towards paying a licensing fee. Licensing fees are not an eligible DAF expense, but it doesn't mean you don't include it in your budget. It means that you just use funds from that other source, say it's another grant from a private foundation, to pay that, and then the DAF funds pay for your other expenses. So please do include in this project budget all of your expenses for the project, because that does make for a stronger application. In-kind support, meaning donated goods or services, doesn't qualify for this 50% cash match, but if you're getting that, let us know, because that also goes towards the overall strength and sustainability of your project. It shows that you have community buy-in, and that whether or not you get fully funded by the DAF grant, the project is still going to happen. Those are all things that make for a stronger application. So think about every expense that is going into this project or your organization, and include it all there, whether it's eligible for funding or not. Just make sure that $1,000 or $5,000 that you request is going to go specifically towards the expenses that are eligible. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about the budget? Yes.
So again, we have to, like, we ask for $4,000, we have to show that we will be paying $4,000 out of pocket.
No, 2,000. Yeah, so it's only a 50% match this year. Yes.
$6,000 or larger.
Correct. That's right.
The maximum size project would be $11,250 for this county.
Yes.
7,500 plus 50%.
That's correct, yeah. Well, you can certainly have more cash match if you have, and just to repeat the question, she was asking, if you have $4,000 that you're requesting, then how much do you have to show that you're getting in cash from other sources? It would be $2,000. If you have more cash than that coming in, great, but that's just the minimum. So your minimum total project budget would have to be $6,000 in that case.
So then the whole budget would be $6,000.
Correct, yeah. Any other? Yes.
Budget form that I downloaded yesterday didn't separate it out this year, the DAF funds and the cash.
Sure. So she's saying the budget form that is now available for download on the website doesn't delineate between the different sources of income. Basically, what I'm going to be looking at in your project budget is, do you have enough cash coming from all sources and from eligible sources, and do you have enough eligible expenses to spend your DAF request on? So there might not be a narrative question that says, here's where I'm getting my money and here's why it's eligible. It just be as clear and concise in your actual budget as possible, and I can sort out that information from there. Yeah. I know it's not as detailed, you know, the requirements are really detailed. The question is not. That's right. So she's just saying, instead of there being separate columns for DAF expenses and other expenses, you're just showing all of your expenses. But I will be able to tell from the information that you submit in your budget whether you've met that requirement. And please do use the budget form that's available for download in the application. We won't be able to accept budgets that you submit in an Excel spreadsheet. Anytime that you see a link in the application for a form that you need to download and use that form. That lets us kind of look at everything consistently and uniformly so that we know that your information, we can compare and contrast and get all the right categories in there. Okay, any other budget questions? I know that's a big one. Yes?
Talks about program ineligibility. If the project's funded in the same year, or overlapping year, by the Louisiana Division of the Arts General Operating Support Grant. So if you get the General Operating Support Grant, you can apply for a project grant?
No, that's not the case. So he's asking, if you get a general operating support grant from LDOA, does that mean you can't apply for this grant? The only eligibility issue would be that if you're getting a general operating support grant from LDOA that's not part of DAF, they have a separate grant program that is for general operating support. You just can't apply for general operating support in this. So you can get a general operating grant from them in their separate grant program and still get project support here. Correct. You can't get organizational support in the DAF grant. Now, when you go to start your application, there's going to be a drop-down window that asks you which category you want to apply in. It's going to give you 3 choices if it still looks the way it did when I logged on, and that's going to be DAF project support, DAF organizational support, and general operating support. That general operating support, that is the other program. So make sure you click one of the options that says DAF, because otherwise you're applying for the wrong grant and I won't get your application. Anybody who's already submitted that grant, you're probably already familiar with the program. Okay, so what happens after you submit your application? We'll just go through a timeline of events. The deadline again is July 13th at 5 p.m. In late August and early September, we will be holding the grant panel. So basically, after you submit your application, I review all of them for basic eligibility, make sure you've got all your forms in place, and then I, fairly soon after, am going to pass on all of that information to our grant reviewers. They're going to spend 3 to 4 weeks reviewing all of your proposals, reading them independently, and then at some date that we determine at the end of August or early September, they're going to get together, talk about it as a group, and make decisions or recommendations about who gets funded. I will send everyone those dates as soon as we have them. They're going to be different for different parishes. We usually have one panel date for East Baton Rouge Parish, and then another one for the second cluster, and then a third for the third cluster. We kind of break up the parishes into groups. And so you'll know what the location is going to be. Usually we have one at the West Baton Rouge Museum, and then another one is going to be at possibly at the Hammond Regional Arts Center. It's where we've done it in the past. It's just kind of the most central locations that we have based on where everybody submits. And like I said, please, if you can, come to those panels. If you're unable to come to the panel meeting, we will send you notes about what the panel reviewers commented about your project, but it's upon request, so you'd have to ask me. We don't do it automatically. And some things just get lost in translation, so it's really, it's better to hear it in person. You kind of lose a little bit in the tone of the conversation, and some side comments that happen. The notes are just kind of the main points that they discussed.
Can I make a comment about that?
Yes.
One year, when in my grant application, one of the questions that came back was, why do they always perform in churches? Why don't they perform somewhere? Livingston Parish, which is right, we have no auditoriums. We have no options but churches. But I didn't think to say that out loud in my grant. So the next year, I put in the sentence that says, we only perform in churches because, and that way, the person listening, reading that,
Yeah.
that's how those notes are very, very helpful.
Yeah, it's a great example of a way that you can improve upon your application from one year to the next, just based on hearing that feedback from the panel. Yes.
I remember a couple years ago, one of the grant panelists said, question our selection of music, and our director was not happy about that. And it turns out that we perform for senior citizens. I'm sorry, but most of them are not going to be interested in hip hop. They want to hear things they remember.
Right.
And that's why we do Broadway musicals majority of the time.
Sure.
Because that's what they like. And so the next time, I really put it over and over again where it asked a question, where I could put it, I said, this is why we use the music that we do, because this is what they remember from when they were young, and we see that it's effective.
Yeah, another great example.
Difference.
Yeah, you're never, it's really hard to predict what someone's question or what they're going to hang up on in your proposal, especially when you are so closely involved with your organization and with your programming on a day-to-day basis. That's why it's always great to have someone else who doesn't know you read that proposal, and not even one of your board members, because they already have a real stake in the game and they know what you do. Just someone else, your friend, your daughter, your mom, whoever, someone who can give you some honest feedback. Yes?
Is there any way to get the notes we got from last fall?
Yes, she's asking if they can get notes from a previous grant panel, and absolutely, I have all of that information saved, so I'm happy to send you the notes from last year. Just send me an email and I'll send it your way. So after we hold the grant panel, we will send those recommendations to our board of directors, they have the ultimate authority to approve those decisions for funding. So what the panel decides is a recommendation. Generally, our board does take those recommendations and approve it, but that's just, this is the steps that we take to kind of ensure checks and balances and make sure that the funding is being allocated fairly. And so that means sometime in September is when you will receive your grant notification, whether or not you were funded. If you come to the grant panel, you'll know what the recommendation is, and you can be fairly certain that that is going to be close to what your actual funding amount will be. And I can, again, if I send your notes upon request, I can give you that information as well. Just know that we do have a pretty high volume of requests for that information on the day of and after a grant panel. And so it just may take some time to get that information to you right after the panel. Just expect a little bit of a delay. The best and quickest way to know what you were recommended for funding is to come to the panel meeting. So, yes, Daniel.
The grant review panel, are there some of them continue from a prior year, percentage that you put new people on, the same people, what is it?
It varies. It's never going to be the exact same group of people because we do want to get different perspectives when possible. He's asking if the grant panel is the same people from year to year. Generally, we'll have maybe one or two that are the same so that we can have some some more experienced panelists there, but that's not necessarily the case. I mean, this year we had one panel that was all first-timers, or maybe they've reviewed grants for other programs. And like I said, it's going to be people from all different sectors. Sometimes it's people who work in fundraising at other organizations, and so they have experience writing grants and kind of know what to look for in reading them. Sometimes it's bankers, attorneys, accountants, people who can look at your financial information and make sound judgments on that. But a lot of times they tend to be people who, while they do that in their day job, they maybe volunteer with an arts organization, they serve on a board, they are artists themselves in their free time, people who care about the arts in their community. But it's, if you are with a youth theater organization, there's a good chance that there might not be anyone working in theater on your panel. And at the very least, there will be several people who don't. So, regular terms of art that you use, industry standards, that's something that you may have to catch them up on and, as it's relevant to your project. But it's going to be a wide range of people. So after you are notified of your funding status, whether or not you were funded. If you were funded, we generally make the first grant payment in January. So even though this period of funding is from October to September, depending on when state funds arrive to LDOA and to us, and they usually, once they get it, turn it around as quickly as possible, that is when we'll be able to cut those first checks. So if you have programming that starts at the very beginning of that grant period, you may have to be covering some of those funds yourself, which is another great reason why matching funds are a sign of a strong program, because it means you will be able to cover those and then you'll be reimbursed for that. That's just going to be the first 75% of your grant payment. The rest comes after your project is complete. So no matter when your program is, at least a part of your grant will be reimbursement. And that's going to take place probably in summer of 2019, again, depending on when those funds come to us. I believe it's usually June or July that we're able to distribute those. And that will happen after you submit your final report. Your final report is due 45 days after the end of your project, the last date of activity. So if that falls early in the year, just submit it and get it over with. Even if you know you're not going to get your final report check until summer, if your project wraps up in winter 2018, 2019, go ahead and submit that final report. And that way you will be among the first round of people to receive those final report checks. If your project is still going on after summer, as long as it's within the grant period of October to September, submit the final report 45 days after, and then as soon as you submit that, then we'll go ahead and send you the check. The absolute last day for final reports is going to be in November of 2019. So if you are, let's say, requesting organizational support, really we still would like you to submit that report 45 days after the end of your fiscal year that you requested funding for. But if that's still going on, then this is the final date, and that's when we need it in order to get your information to the state, so that so they can get their reports due on time. So anything after any final reports that are submitted late after this November date, you're jeopardizing your final grant check. You may not be eligible to get that funding if you don't submit it on time. And so obviously I recommend starting it before that so that if any questions or problems come up, you have expenses that you thought were eligible and they're not, I can work with you on how to, frame your report so that you get the funding that you were awarded.
The final reports are on the old website?
The final reports are not available yet. So, right, even for last year, and we sent this out in an email last week. So we're asking that if you received a DAF grant for 2018, this past year, if you have not already submitted your final report, hold off on doing that. The MGO website, that is going to be the new grant website, they have not, at least as of the last time I checked, they have not opened up the final report function. Because they're still building it. They wanted to get the application done first to give you as much time as possible to look through that application before that July 13th deadline. And I believe that they're finalizing that now, and it should be available soon. So next year, of course, you'll submit your final report there. This year, we would like you to submit your final report there if you haven't already. If you already submitted it on Fluid Review, you're fine. I've already got that information. I can download it and transfer it if I need to. But the questions will be similar to what they've been in the past. So if you need to start preparing some information, getting some documents together, all of that is going to be the same. You're still going to have to show your proof, your documentation of grant expenses. So that means you have to show the invoice or contract for services, as well as the form of documentation of payment. So if it's a check, that's a canceled check, meaning you have evidence from the bank that it has cleared.
Does it have to be front and back? Because now your bank statements have the date on it and the front, and they're all little short-looking cabbage things. But, but they don't have the signature page unless you.
Sure, She's asking me if it has to be the front and back of the check. If at all possible, yes, do send the front and back. If your bank doesn't make that available, whatever you submit, just make it clear to your banker what your requirements are, that you need to show that the check has cleared. They may have a different way of doing that. If it's a statement, we don't want to see your whole bank statement for the month, but we also need to be sure that it's an official document. So it can't just be, somebody once submitted, kind of a cut and pasted screenshot of that statement of just the check. But if all I have is a picture of that check and not the document that says Chase Bank, with that official watermark, or whatever it may be, then I don't know what that check, I don't know what that is. I can't confirm that it's an official. So it just needs to be an official bank document that indicates how that check was delivered and cleared the bank, that somebody deposited it. And if you're writing checks to artists and they don't deposit it, you just got to stay on them. Because sometimes that happens. You do write the check and they just sits in their pocket. So you want to know, did you spend the grant money? Because occasionally that happens. Yes, you have a question?
Well, what I've always done, as working with a school, is that we get the bank statement, we just black out everything that doesn't apply.
Sure, and that's fine too. Yes. And there may be, yeah, it's hard to say because I haven't seen the new final report form yet, but I think that should work. And there will also be some kind of a spreadsheet that you have to fill out listing which documentations are there. So as long as it's clear, at least my criteria in reviewing these reports in the past, as long as it's clear that I know what the money was spent on, so that's where the invoice comes in, and that I know that it was actually deposited. That's going to be different for different types of expenses. Sometimes if you're an organization, it may be your bank statement that shows your payroll. Or, if it's for arts products that were purchased online, then that may be an online receipt. There's different documents that will work, but it's hard to say which ones qualify and which don't unless I'm looking at the particular program. But usually we can handle that on kind of a case-by-case basis, which is, again, a good reason to start your report as early as possible so that if you do have to contact your bank and hunt down some new documents, you're not doing it at the 11th hour, because it can sometimes take a while for them to get back to you. Yes?
Will the grant award amounts be calculated in the same fashion as previously?
Yes, she's asking how the grant award amounts will be calculated. So using those criteria that we showed, artistic merit and the different percentages that each criteria is weighted, the grant panel is going to give a score for each proposal in each of those categories. Those numbers are tallied and they're averaged. So, if you have one reviewer that's especially tough or one reviewer that's very lenient, they're still consistent throughout all of the reviews. And so it averages out as long as they grade everyone on the same, on the same scale. So that creates an average score for everyone. At the end of the day, after we've reviewed all of the grants, we will post a spreadsheet with all of those scores. You'll be sorted from highest to lowest. And then we'll kind of plug in how many dollars we have and go through some different scenarios of how they want that funding to be allocated. So I will say in the past few panels that I have administered, very few people are fully funded, but they do tend to look at the very highest applications and at least try to consider fully funding them. And then decreasing, the percentage of your request awarded based on the percentage, on the score that you received. It's not going to correlate exactly because we just don't have necessarily the funds like, oh, you scored a 90, that means you get 90% of your request. It just depends on how the grant scores shake out. And ultimately, the panel is who makes those recommendations, but I'm here to make sure that when they do allocate based on those scores, that it's done fairly. So that if everyone who scored in the 90s receives the same amount of funding, that if someone who scores a 95 and another 95 are going to get the same amount of funding if they requested the same. Fairness in that way, if that makes sense. And typically there are always at least a few grants that don't get funded. And that's because the panel tends to, even though they want to fund everyone, and if there were more dollars available, they certainly would, they tend to want to give more funding to the stronger applications so that we can make a better impact on those programs rather than just spreading it really thin and giving everybody just a few dollars. So that's probably how, if I had to guess, that it will shake out this year. When more funding was available, then there might be some instances where everybody got at least some portion of their request, but that's just not the case anymore. Yes, you have a question?
Yes, will this new system archive previous applications, so like if you submit this year, will you be able to go back and look at it next year?
Right, so she's asking if this system is going to archive applications. Yes, I believe that it will. Because when you log on, you can always go back to your previous request. I'll double check that with the state. A word on that too, and I'm going to be sending an email about this later this week, is that since we are moving to this new system, this MGO, the Arts Council are going to be sunsetting the Fluid Review grant website. And it's actually happening on June 22nd. So as of that date, we will no longer have access to any information there, and neither will you. You won't be able to log in and see your previous submissions. So I'm giving everyone as much notice as I can and sending an email with instructions on how you can download any of your previous submissions, because I know a lot of people use that website as an archive for your previous submissions, and unfortunately, they won't keep those once we discontinue our use. So it is possible to go in and download each submission in its entirety as a PDF, and I'll send those instructions soon. But yes.
What are you going to use for PAG?
We haven't determined what we're going to use for PAG yet, for the PAG grant. Since we've moved to just one submission per year, the next PAG application is going to be due in February 2019. We may end up using MGO if they're able to kind of add us in as a component. That would be great if you'd be able to go to the same website for all of your applications. It just depends if they have the capability to add us in that time. In the meantime, if you have received a PAG grant or a Lamar grant or any other grant application from us, and your report is going to be coming up soon, you'll be able to go to our website, I think as of tomorrow, and download a form. So we have kind of a temporary grant document that you can use to file that report. And it's just a Microsoft Word document with fillable forms. It's going to be the same exact information. You'll just have to fill that out and email it to me with your attachments rather than submit it through Fluid Review. You know, if you submit it to Fluid Review before June 22nd, technically I'll still get it. But I would highly recommend just waiting until we put that form on our website and download it and use it. Same thing for if you want to apply for a grant. It's called the Charles Lamar Family Foundation Shaw Center Subsidy Grant. It's a mouthful, but we just call it the Lamar Grant. Basically, that is a local private foundation that allows you to apply for funding to help subsidize the cost of rentals at the Shaw Center. So if you're renting any space in the Shaw Center for an arts event or a cultural event, you can apply for this grant. It's a rolling deadline throughout the year. You will also be able to apply for that grant with just a simple Microsoft Word document that'll be available on our website this week. And the reports are the same for that too. Yes. It's a transition, but I think that this form, this MGO form, is going to be really helpful. They've got a great tutorial, and you know, if you've already filled out applications online through Fluid Review, this is going to be a breeze for you because it is generally the same kind of process. You just upload everything online. It's much easier than a paper application, and it just, you know, makes life easier for everyone. Any other questions? Yes.
Can we know what's the total amount of money available this year for distribution?
Yes, it's in the guidelines, and I believe in East Baton Rouge Parish, the maximum amount that you can request is $7,500. I'll have to double check that, but that would mean you would have to have $7,500 plus half that in your total project budget. And generally, the total amount of grant funds that we have available to distribute is about $150,000, but that's broken up into several parishes. It's somewhere around $70,000 for EBR. I can't say off the top of my head what it is in other parishes, but you can find all that in the guidelines. Great. Any other questions? Let's see. My last slide and a little bit of information for you is to tell you about the Art Summit, and this is especially relevant here because we are going to have at least one session about grant writing. It unfortunately falls after this DAF deadline, so you won't necessarily be able to apply what you've learned on this application, but it's still going to be a really great session. So the Art Summit is an event that we offer annually. It's professional development and workshops and resources for people working for arts organizations, for individual artists, and really just for the creative community in general. So we'll be presenting on a variety of topics. If you go to artsbr.org, you can see what the tentative schedule is like. That may change a little bit, but the topics are going to remain the same, and we're working on finalizing our speaker list. But I believe on the 26th is the day that we're going to offer that grant writing. It's going to be just a little bit more intensive and about grants in general rather than a specific DAF workshop or a PAG workshop. It's just going to be how to tell your story better through grants, how to write stronger proposals, and it's not going to be taught by me. We're bringing in someone who has raised a lot more money than I am, and she's I think if we confirm that, it's going to be a really great presentation, and I would recommend going to the whole event. So, yeah, find out about that on our website. Any other questions about the DAF grant, the summit, life, traffic, weather? I don't know. Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming. Certainly, if you have any follow-up questions, thank you. Please email me, call me. This is what I'm here for. And I look forward to seeing everything that you have going on this year. It's exciting.